Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Samich Zayin Amud Aleph. Sorry, Daf Samich Vav Amud Beis. 5 lines from the bottom. The Gemara previously brought that the Korban Tamid as well as the Korban Pesach are Doiches HaShabbos. We learn out, it says in the Pasuk Moyadoi Gabe Korban Tamid, and it says Moyado Gabe Korban Pesach. Learning a Gezer Shava, just as the Korban Tamid is Doiche Es HaShabbos, so too the Korban Pesach is Doiche Es HaShabbos. Says the Gemara, Eshkechon Tamid uPesach Dedochu Shabbos. We find, as the Brisa stated before, that the Korban Tamid as well as the Korban Pesach is Doiche Es HaShabbos. Dedochu Tuma Minolam. But where do we know that indeed Tuma is also Doiche? Omrei, they said, Ki hechi dil yalif Pesach mi Tamid le'inyan Shabbos. The same way that we learn out Pesach from Tamid, the Gezerah Shava, of Mo'adoi Mo'adoi, Hochanami yalif Tamid Pesach le'inyan Tuma. So too, when it comes to learning out from Pesach, we'll also say that just as Pesach is going to be Doiche the Tuma, so too, Korban Tamid will also be Doiche the Tuma. Ask the Gemara about Pesach Gufa Menole. Where do we know that Korban Pesach is Doiche Tuma? How do we know that when the Tzibor is in a state of Tuma, or at least Roiv of the Tzibor is in a state of Tuma, nonetheless they can still bring the Korban Pesach? Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, the Omar Kro, it says in the Pasuk, Ish Ish Ki Yetome La Nefesh. Here it's talking about where a person is tamei, or if he's derech rechoika, and therefore it's not possible for him to bring the Korban Pesach on Yud Daled ben Nisan because of an oines. So therefore he's able to bring the Korban Pesach on Yud Daled B'iyar, what's called Korban Pesach Sheni. So it says in the pasuk again, Ish Ish ki yeh tamei lo nefesh, Ish nidche le Pesach Sheni. Vein Sibor Nitchin the Pesach Sheni Ele Avde Betuma. Rabbi Yochanan learns the individual who cannot bring a Korban Pesach on Yud Daled ben Nisan is Nitche. He's pushed off to then be able to bring it on 1 month later on Yud Daled B'iyar Pesach Sheni. However, the Tzibur, the diuk is that the individual is pushed off to then bring it only a month later and cannot bring it on that day of Yud Daled ben Nisan. But the Tzibur who is Tamei could bring it on Yud Daled ben Nisan. Omar le Reish Lakish le Rabbi Yochanan Ema ish nitche le Pesach Sheni tzibur lesluhu takanto loy ba Pesach Rishon v'loy ba Pesach Sheni. Reish Lakish argues on Rabbi Yochanan and says from this pasuk you can learn even a stringency. You can say that when it comes to the individual who is tamei, so he's pushed off and cannot bring the Korban Pesach on Yud Daled ben Nisan. He has to wait a month later to the Yud Daled B'iyar. But the Tzibur who is Tamei, they don't have the opportunity not to bring the Korban Pesach Rishon and not to bring Korban Pesach Sheni. Elom Rabbi Shimon Lakish mehacha. Rather, therefore, says Rabbi Shimon Lakish, you have to learn out that Tuma is Nidche, that the Tzibur can bring a Korban Pesach, although they are in a state of Tuma, from the following pasuk. It says, Vayishalchu min hamachane kol tzarua v'kol zov v'kol tamei lanefesh. Here it's talking about somebody who's in a state of Tuma. He is to be sent out of the machne, depending on his state of Tuma. Yoimar tmei mesim val yoimar zovin umitzaroin. Why doesn't it just state in the pasuk that the Tmei Mesim, they are subject to be then sent out of the Machane, and then Kol Sheken will learn out to Zavim and Mitzar who are more severe, as follows. Vani Oimer in Tmei Mesim Mishtalchin Zavim Mitzaroin lo Kol Sheken. If those who are Tmei Meis have to go out of the Machane, then certainly those who are Tmei because of Zav, of Ziva, or of a Mitzara would have to go to the Machane because they're even more stringent than that of the Tmei Mesim. On top of Samach Zayin Amud Aleph at the top, Ella says the Gemara, Yesh lecha shor shezovin u'mitzaroim mishtalchin vein Tmei Mesim mishtalchin. Says Reish Lakish, therefore, there are certain instances that the Zov and Mitzuroin, the Zov and the Mitzorah have to be sent out of the Machane, whereas the ones who are just Tamei Meis do not. In other words, they can remain in the Azara and bring a carbon. Ve'ezezeh, and what are we referring to there? For Pesach haba betuma, that when it comes to a carbon Pesach and the Tzibor, the Roiv of the Tzibor is in a state of Tuma, they are permitted to bring a carbon Pesach. So that's the source, says Reish Lakish. Omar Abaye Bar comes to argue on Reish Lakish, Ihochi, if the source is indeed from sending out of the Machane, asks Abaye, Ihochi leimonami, then you should also then say the following based on this pasuk. Yoimar Zov utmei mesim, both the Zvav and the Tmei mesim, Val Yoimar Mitzorah, don't mention anything about Mitzorah. Since Mitzorah is more severe than not only the Tamei Meis, but even the Zav, you don't have to mention the Mitzorah. Vani Oimer Zav Mishtalach Mitzorah Lo Kol Shekain. Once I already mentioned that the Zav has to go out of the Machane, then certainly the Mitzorah would have to go out of the Machane. So the fact that it mentioned Mitzorah is unnecessary. Elo, it must be Yesh L'Chashash Mitzorah Orin Mishtalchin. There's a certain time when the Mitzorah does have to leave the Machane. Ve'ein Zavin Utmei Meis Mishtalchin. Whereas the Zavin and those who are Tamei Meis do not have to leave the Machane. And what are we referring to? Says the Gemara. Ve'ezezeh Pesach haba betuma. This is talking about that not only is a Tamei Meis, but even a Zav can then go ahead and bring a Pesach when they're in the state of Tuma. Says the Gemara, V'chitei mahachinami. If you're going to say this is true, Abaye comes to then prove that this can't be so. V'hatnan, because it says in the Mishnah, Pesach haba betuma. One who brings the Korban Pesach in a state of Tuma, lo yoichlu mimeno. That means when the Tzibor brings the Korban Pesach in a state of Tuma, lo yoichlu mimenu zavim v'zavois, nidos v'vlodois, v'yoldois, imochlu p'turin. Here it states in the Mishnah Befeirush that although the Tzibur who is in a state of Tuma, who brings the Korban Pesach, namely the state of Tuma, of Tumas Meis, those Zavim cannot partake in the Korban Pesach. So we see that a Zav is excluded from the Korban Pesach. Elom Rabbi, therefore Abaye says, you have to go back to the original limud that Rabbi Yochanan brought. Lo'oila mikro kama, the first pasuk that we brought of ish, that the pasuk says, each person ki yeh tamei, that somebody is tamei, that we brought before. That's the pasuk that we're going to then prove that the state of Tuma, when the roiv of the tzibor is in a state of Tuma, it's nidche, and you can still bring the Korban Pesach. Imkain. So then Abaye has to explain up Reish Lakish's question on Rabbi Yochanan's drasha, because Reish Lakish asked before, if indeed you're going to use this pasuk, then he asked, then you can say the stringency. There's only the individual who cannot bring, who's Tamei, cannot bring the Korban Pesach on Yudale ben Nisan. He's pushed off to Yudale ben Be'iyar. But the Tzibur who is Tamei, they cannot bring not the Korban Pesach Rishon, not Korban Pesach Sheni. On that explains Abaye the following: In kei nichtav rachmana ish ki yeh tamei la nefesh lamali. Why does it say la nefesh? It should have just excluded the word la nefesh and say each person who is in a state of tuma, and that would stop over there. V'chitema, and that would include all those who are tamei, not only because of state of tuma because of tumas meis, but all other types of tuma. V'chitema hay la nefesh lahachida also. If you're going to say la nefesh comes to teach us this, hatmei meis hu denidcha lepesach sheni aval shar tmeim loy. Then you'll say only that which is tamei meis can bring a Korban Pesach a month later, but the other forms of tuma, namely a zav or mitzvah, cannot bring a Korban Pesach sheni. V'atanya. But it states, Yachol lo yu oisim Pesach sheni ela tmei meisim v'yishu b'derech rechoika. I only think that which is stated explicitly in the Torah, that which is tamei because he's tamei meis, or if he's rochoik, he's derech rechoika and he can't bring the Korban Pesach on Yudale ben Nisan. Then he's able to bring it on Yudale be'iyar. But zavin u'mitzaroin u'bo'ale nidois minayin. Where to know these other forms of tuma, they can also bring the Korban Pesach Sheni on Yudale B'iyar. Talmud loymar ish la nefesh. Dikos Rachmana Lamali. Therefore, it says Ish La Nefesh. Dikos Rachmana Lamali. Why does it come to teach us? Elahachi Ka'amar Ish Nidcha LePesach Sheni Ve'ein Sibor Nidcha LePesach Sheni Ela Avdi Betuma. In other words, Abaye says, since we already have the pasuk teaching me that all other tumas can also bring the carbon individually, can bring the carbon on Pesach Sheni. So why does it state therefore La Nefesh? Coming to teach me that then the individual can only bring on the Korban Pesach Sheni, Yudalid Be'iyar. The Tzibor, they're permitted to bring a Korban Pesach in their state of Tumah even on Yudalid Be'Nisan. V'chi avdi betuma betame meis, aval shar tumas le'avdi. And that's only true. Why does it say lanefesh? Only those who are tame meis, the tzibur is tame because the tame meis can bring the carbon on Yud Daled Ben Nisan. But other forms of tuma, if the tzibur is tame, as let's say mitzara, they could not bring the carbon pesach. That's why it says lanefesh. Omar Rav Chizda. So now we have different understandings of where is the limud from that the carbon pesach, even when the tzibur is in a state of tuma, can go ahead and bring the carbon pesach, and Abai prove from ish. Now the Gemara says, Omar Rav Chizda, in regards to these different forms of tuma leaving the machane, where do they have to leave from? Mitzara shenichnas lifnim mimechitza potter. A mitzara who enters lifnim mimechitza, so inside of his mechitza, although he's not allowed to do so, but he's going to be potter from malkus. Shenemar, it states bodad yeshev michutz lamachane moshavoi. It states over here that he alone has to sit outside of the machane. Hakosuv nitkoy le'esei. So Rav Chisda says the reason why he does not get malkus is because it's a lash nitak la'esei. It comes to say that he's not going to get malchus because it has a form that is remedying the lav. Eisvei, the Gemara asks on Rav Chizda, if you're going to say that when the mitzvah goes back into the machane, he's not going to be chayim malchus, well, we have a brisa that says otherwise. Mitzvah shenichnas lifnim mimichitzosei ba'arboim. That the mitzvah who does go back inside in a state of tumas mitzvah, he will get malchus arboim. The brisa continues, Zavim v'zavoy shenichnasu lifnim mechitzason be'arboim. So too, the Zavim v'zavoys that enter and go back into the place where they're not supposed to be, namely the Machne Leviyah, they will also then get the set of Malchus of Arboim. Utmei meis muter likanes lemachne Leviyah. The Tmei meis are permitted to go into the Machne Leviyah. V'lo Tmei meis milvad amru ela afilu meis atzmoi. But not only somebody who's Tamei as a result of being in contact with a mace or being the oil mace or over a mace, which makes him tumas mace, is he permitted to go in the Machane Leviyah. Ella, even the mace itself, Shenemar, we're in Posuk. Vayikach Moshe es atzmois Yosef. Moshe Rabbeinu brought the bones of Yosef Hatzadik, imo, together with him. Imoy b'mechitzasoi, together with him in his mechitza. In other words, since Moshe Rabbeinu was a Levi, so therefore he brought the bones even with him in his mechitza in Machane Leviyah, the bones itself. Al Kopanim, we're left with the question of Rav Chisda. How can Rav Chisda say that those mitzara who goes into the machane after having left the machane in a state of tuma, he is not going to get malchus? Hooray, the Brisa says otherwise. Says the Gemara Tanoi, it's a machlokes Tanoim. The Tanya bodad yeshev levado yeshev. The Pasuk says, Bodad Yeshev, he will sit alone, the Mitzara. He alone will sit. Shelo yutmei machim yoshvimo. He will not be with all the other tmeim. In other words, this opinion holds that he's got to be all the way outside of all three machanos. The machane Shechina, the machane Leviyah, as well as the machane Yisrael. He has to go outside, of all three. Yochol I might think that the Zavin and Tmei Mesim can be sent out to the same machane. The machane Shechina. Talmud loymar v'yitamu es machanehem. It states in the pasuk plural machanehem. Litain machane lezeh, machane lezeh. Di Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says each one has their own machane that they have to go out with. In other words, the most lenient is Tamei Meis. He has to leave machane shchina. The next severe is Zov. He has to leave machane levia. And the most severe, that is the Mitzvah, who has to leave not only the Shechina and Machane Levia, but also the Machane Yisrael. Rabbi Shimon Oimer, Eino Tzorich. Rabbi Shimon argues on this drasha, and he says, we don't need this. Harehu Oimer, Vaishalchu min ha-machane, kol tzarua, v'kol zov, v'kol tamei lenefesh. We have the pasuk that says explicitly that they will be sent out from the Machane, all of those who are Metzora, and those Zov and the Tmei Nefesh. Yoimar, to teach me, Tmei Meis, Val Yoimar, Tmei Zov. To teach me that those who are Tmei Meis are not Tmei Zov. Vani Oimer, Tmei Meisim Mishtalchin Zovin Lo Koshakein. The fact that it has to say it, I certainly would already know it, because Zovin is more severe than Tmei Meis. Lama Nemar Zov, so why does it have to mention Zov? Litain Loi Machane Shnia, to teach me that he has to go out of the Machane Levia. So why have to mention Mitzvah? Hare, a kol sheken can be made because Mitzvah is more chamur than Zov. If the Zovin has to go out, then the Mitzvah certainly has to go out. Elo, what is it coming to teach you? Even though the Zov has to go out from Machane Levia, the Mitzvah has to go out even from the Machane Yisrael. Therefore, comes along Rabbi Shimon and says that the posuk is coming to teach me Yeshev Badad, that he has to then teach me that he's coming to say that there's a positive command for him to sit alone outside the machane. And since it's a positive command, it's called a lav shenitek la'aseh, whereby he will not get malchus.